97% of storage used. If you run out of space, you can't save to Drive or back up Google Photos. Get 100 gigabytes of storage for $1.99 $0 and 49 cents per month for 3 months. Hey there, history nerds. Tonight we're talking about a civilization so advanced, so powerful, and so ridiculously wealthy that it makes every ancient empire look like a neighborhood garage sale. I'm talking about Atlantis, the legendary island that supposedly had walls covered in gold, a mysterious metal nobody's ever seen since, and an army of over 1 million soldiers. Oh, and it vanished in a single day. Just poof. Gone. Now here's the kicker. Everything, and I mean everything we know about this place, comes from one guy. One Greek philosopher writing about something that allegedly happened 9,000 years before his time. That's like me telling you detailed stories about the Ice Age because my great-great-great times 1,000 grandfather left some notes. So before we dive into this ancient mystery that's been driving people absolutely insane for 2,500 years, do me a favour, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Whether you're in Tokyo at 3 AM or chilling in Sao Paulo, I want to know who's joining me on this journey into the deep. And hey, if you're into stories about lost civilizations, impossible engineering, and catastrophic divine punishment, smash that subscribe button. Alright, grab your diving gear, we're going down. Now, let me paint you a picture. It's roughly 360 BCE, and a 70-something-year-old philosopher named Plato is sitting in Athens, probably surrounded by scrolls and annoyed students, and he decides to write about an island. Not just any island, an island so magnificent, so impossibly wealthy, and so technologically advanced that it makes every civilization of his time look like they're still figuring out how fire works. And here's the beautiful irony. This story, written as a philosophical dialogue that most scholars believe was meant to illustrate a political point, would go on to become the single most enduring mystery in human history. Plato had no idea what he was starting. If he could see the thousands of books, documentaries, conspiracy theories, and underwater expeditions his little tale would spawn, he'd probably ask for royalties. But why? Why does Atlantis refuse to die? We've had countless myths and legends throughout history. The Greeks alone gave us enough material to fill several streaming services, gods turning into swans, heroes fighting hydras, women being kidnapped by underworld deities. Yet most of these stories stay exactly where they belong, in mythology textbooks and the occasional Hollywood adaptation. Atlantis, though. Atlantis jumped out of the mythology section and landed squarely in the maybe this actually happened category. And it's been camping there for 2,400 years, refusing to leave despite every scientist in the room politely asking it to go home. The answer lies in something deeply human. See, we have this persistent, almost desperate need to believe that somewhere in the distant past there existed a golden age. A time when humanity had figured it out, when we built magnificent cities, lived in harmony with nature, possessed knowledge we've since forgotten. It's the same impulse that makes us romanticize every historical period until we actually learn what it was like to live in it. Medieval times? Sounds great until you remember the plague, the lack of dental care, and the average life expectancy of good luck making it to 40. But a lost civilization that vanished before recorded history, that's the ultimate blank canvas. We can project whatever we want onto it because nobody's around to correct us. And Atlantis isn't just any lost civilization story. It's got everything. Advanced technology that shouldn't have existed. Wealth beyond imagination. A moral fall from grace. Divine punishment. And a catastrophic ending that wiped the slate clean in a single day. It's basically a blockbuster movie plot that Plato accidentally wrote 2 millennia before cinema existed. You've got your utopia, your corruption arc, your apocalyptic finale, all wrapped up in a package that's just vague enough to invite endless speculation, but just detailed enough to feel weirdly specific. Plato gave us dimensions, population counts, architectural details, even the names of the kings. For a guy supposedly making up a philosophical allegory, he really committed to the world building. This is what makes Atlantis different from, say, El Dorado or Shangri-La. Those are vague concepts, cities of gold, hidden paradises. Atlantis has a floor plan. Plato tells us it was built in concentric rings of water and land. He tells us the central island was about 5 stades in diameter, roughly half a mile. He describes the metals covering the walls, the temples dedicated to Poseidon, the bridges and tunnels connecting the rings. He even mentions the hot and cold springs on the central island, which is a weirdly specific detail for something you're supposedly inventing to make a philosophical point. It's like someone today writing a parable about the dangers of greed and then including the exact GPS coordinates of the fictional city. Naturally, this level of detail has convinced generations of enthusiasts that Plato wasn't making things up. He was recording something real. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is the part that keeps the mystery alive. Plato didn't claim to have invented this story. He said it came from somewhere else. Specifically, he said it came from Egypt. And not just any random Egyptian source. He traced it through a very specific chain of transmission that goes something like this. Egyptian priests told it to a Greek statesman named Solon, who brought it back to Athens, where it passed through. Several generations until it reached Plato's family. Now, Solon wasn't some random traveller. He was one of the 7 sages of Greece, a legendary lawmaker and poet who reformed Athenian society in the early 6th century BCE. The man had credibility. So when Plato says Solon heard this from Egyptian priests, he's not citing some anonymous guy he met at a symposium. He's invoking one of the most respected figures in Greek history. Let's talk about these Egyptian priests for a moment, because they're crucial to understanding why this story has such staying power. Around 590 BCE, roughly 150 years before Plato was born, Solon travelled to Egypt. This wasn't unusual for educated Greeks of his time. Egypt was ancient even then, a civilization that had been building monuments and keeping records while the Greeks were still figuring out the basics. For a Greek intellectual, visiting Egypt was like a modern academic visiting the world's oldest library, combined with the world's most prestigious university. You went there to learn, to access knowledge that simply didn't exist anywhere else. Solon ended up in Sais, a city in the Nile Delta that served as the capital of Egypt during the 26th dynasty. Sais was home to the Temple of Neith, a goddess the Greeks associated with Athena, which probably made Solon feel right at home. And it was here, according to Plato's account, that Solon had a conversation that would echo through millennia. He was chatting with the priests about ancient history, probably trying to impress them with tales of Greek antiquity, the flood of Deucalion, the earliest Athenian kings, that sort of thing. And one of the elderly priests basically laughed at him. "Oh, Solon, Solon," the priest reportedly said, "you Greeks are always children. There is no such thing as an old Greek." Brutal? Absolutely. But the priest had a point. From an Egyptian perspective, Greek civilization was basically a startup. The Greeks had maybe a few centuries of recorded history at that point. The Egyptians? They had been meticulously documenting everything for thousands of years. They had temple archives going back further than the Greeks could even imagine. And it was from these archives, according to Plato's account, that the priest revealed the story of Atlantis, a war that happened 9,000 years before Solon's visit, a conflict between an ancient Athenian civilization and a massive island empire that had tried to conquer the Mediterranean world. Now let's pause here and appreciate the math, because this is where skeptics start raising their eyebrows so high they risk pulling a muscle. 9,000 years before Solon's visit would put the Atlantis story around 9,600 BCE. For context, that's the end of the last ice age. Humans were still primarily hunter-gatherers. The agricultural revolution hadn't happened yet. The oldest known permanent settlements were just beginning to emerge. The idea that there was an advanced civilization with metal walls, massive temples, and a navy of 1,200 ships at this time is, to put it mildly, challenging to conventional archaeology. It's like finding a smartphone in a dinosaur fossil, technically not impossible, but requiring some significant revision of everything we think we know. But here's the thing that keeps the flame burning for Atlantis believers. We keep finding out that ancient history is older and more complex than we thought. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey pushed back the date of monumental architecture by thousands of years. Underwater discoveries off the coasts of Japan, India, and the Mediterranean have revealed structures that were submerged when sea levels rose after the Ice Age. Every decade or so, something turns up that makes archaeologists scratch their heads and say, "Okay, we need to revise our timeline again." This doesn't prove Atlantis existed, obviously, but it does provide just enough oxygen to keep the hope alive. Maybe the Egyptians really did have records of something. Maybe there was a civilization lost to rising seas and catastrophic geological events. Maybe Plato wasn't just philosophizing. Maybe he was preserving a genuine memory of the prehistoric world. The Egyptian priests in Plato's telling had an explanation for why they remembered things that the Greeks had forgotten. They said that humanity periodically gets wiped out by catastrophes, sometimes fire, sometimes flood, and that each time civilization has to start over from scratch. But Egypt, protected by its geography and the Nile's reliability, escaped the worst of these disasters. The priests kept records while everyone else was busy trying to survive. They were essentially the backup drive of ancient human memory, storing information that other civilizations had lost to war, disaster, and the simple passage of time. It's a convenient explanation, and maybe a little too convenient, but it's also not entirely implausible. Egypt really was remarkably stable compared to other ancient civilizations. Their record-keeping really was exceptional. Is it possible they preserved memories that other cultures forgot? It's not the craziest idea in the world. Solon, according to Plato, was so fascinated by the Atlantis story that he wanted to turn it into an epic poem, something to rival Homer's works. Unfortunately for us, he never finished it. Maybe he got too busy with other things, maybe the project was too ambitious, or maybe, as some skeptics suggest, he never actually heard the story in the first place, and Plato made the whole thing up. We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that the story somehow made its way through Solon's family, first to his relative Dropides, then to Dropides' son Critias the Elder, and finally to Critias the Younger, who was Plato's own great-uncle or something along those lines. Ancient Greek family trees are confusing. The point is, by the time Plato wrote it down, the story had allegedly been passed through at least 4 generations of his own family. Some see this as evidence that it was a genuine family tradition, carefully preserved. Others see it as a convenient excuse that would prevent anyone from fact-checking. And this is where we sit 2,400 years later, still arguing about whether any of this actually happened. The chain of transmission, Egyptian priest to Solon to Critias to Plato, is elegant enough to be believable but untraceable enough to be suspicious. No Egyptian records of Atlantis have ever been found. No Greek sources before Plato mention it. The story exists solely because one philosopher in Athens decided to write it down in a couple of dialogues that he may or may not have intended as historical fact. It's the ultimate trust me bro of ancient history. But maybe that's exactly why it endures. Atlantis occupies this perfect space between the possible and the unprovable. It's too detailed to dismiss as pure fantasy, too unsupported to accept as fact. It invites us to wonder, to explore, to imagine what might have been. Every generation projects its own hopes and fears onto this blank canvas of a lost civilization. In the 19th century, Atlantis was a highly advanced race that seeded all subsequent cultures. In the 20th century, it became everything from an alien outpost to a repository of ancient wisdom that could save humanity. Today, it's a cautionary tale about climate change and the vulnerability of coastal civilizations. The myth adapts because it's designed to carry meaning, whatever meaning we need it to carry. So what really happened? Did Solon truly sit with Egyptian priests and sayers and hear about a lost civilization? Did those priests really have access to records going back 9,000 years? Or did Plato, one of history's greatest storytellers disguised as a philosopher, simply invent the whole thing to make a point about hubris, ideal societies, and the consequences of moral decay? Honestly, we might never know. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the not knowing is exactly what makes Atlantis immortal. As long as there's uncertainty, there's hope. As long as there's hope, people will keep searching. And as long as people keep searching, the whispers from the abyss will never fall silent. We've traced the story back to its alleged source, the mysterious priests of Egypt, the legendary Solon, the family tradition that brought it to Plato's attention. But now it's time to look at what Plato actually described. Because if you think the origin story is wild, wait until you hear about the city itself. We're talking about an engineering project so ambitious, so impossibly complex that it makes every wonder of the ancient world look like a middle school science fair entry. Concentric rings of water and land, walls covered in precious metals, underground tunnels for ships, hot springs and cold springs on the same island. Either Plato was describing something he genuinely believed existed, or the man missed his calling as a fantasy novelist. Either way, the architecture of Atlantis is where this story truly gets fascinating. Picture this. You're an ancient Greek merchant sailing your rickety wooden boat across the Mediterranean, proud of your civilization's achievements. You've got olive oil to trade, some decent pottery, maybe a few amphorae of wine. Life is good. Then you round a corner and see Atlantis for the first time. Concentric rings of water and land stretching for miles, walls gleaming with bronze and tin and some reddish metal you've never seen before, ships disappearing into underground tunnels like it's the most normal thing in the world. At that moment, your olive oil trade suddenly feels a lot less impressive. Congratulations, you've just experienced what historians call civilization envy, and Plato's description of Atlantis has been causing it for over 2 millennia. Let's break down what Plato actually described, because the architectural details are where this story goes from interesting myth to wait, what? The island of Atlantis, according to the Critias dialogue, was originally a mountain surrounded by sea, located just beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. Poseidon, god of the sea, fell in love with a mortal woman named Clito who lived on this mountain, and like any responsible deity trying to impress a date, he decided to completely terraform the landscape. Not with flowers or a nice beach house, mind you, but by carving the entire mountain into a series of alternating rings of sea and land. Because when you're the god of the ocean, subtlety is apparently not in your vocabulary. The central island, where Clito lived, was about 5 stades in diameter, roughly half a mile or about 900 meters, depending on which ancient measurement conversion you trust. Surrounding this central island were 2 rings of land and 3 rings of water, each one larger than the last. The innermost water ring was 1 stade wide, the next land ring was 1 stade wide, and so on, expanding outward in a pattern that would make any urban planner weep with either admiration or frustration. The whole complex, from centre to outer edge, supposedly measured about 27 stades in diameter, somewhere around 3 miles across. Not exactly a small project for a weekend renovation. Now, here's where the engineering gets truly ambitious. These weren't just decorative moats you could wade across. The water rings were deep enough for ships to sail through, and the Atlanteans had carved tunnels through each ring of land so that vessels could pass from the outer ocean all the way to the central island. Imagine a system of maritime highways running beneath the earth, large enough for ancient triremes to navigate. The largest of these tunnels was supposedly 300 feet wide and 100 feet high, dimensions that would be impressive for a modern infrastructure project, let alone something allegedly built over 11,000 years ago. The Atlanteans essentially invented the shipping canal several millennia before the Suez or Panama, and they put it underground just to show off. But wait, there's more. Because apparently carving your island into a giant target symbol and digging ship-sized tunnels wasn't ambitious enough, the Atlanteans also decided to connect everything with bridges. Stone bridges spanned each water ring wide enough for 2 chariots to pass each other, and these bridges had towers and gates at each end for defence. The whole system was essentially a series of concentric fortress walls with naval access built in. If you wanted to attack the central island, you'd have to cross multiple water barriers, breach multiple walls, and navigate through tunnels that the defenders could presumably flood or collapse at will. Militarily speaking, it was brilliant. Practically speaking, it sounds like the kind of thing a very creative architect would design, and then hand to the engineers with a cheerful, "good luck with this one." And then there's the matter of the walls themselves. Plato didn't just describe stone fortifications, that would be too ordinary. No, each ring of wall was covered in a different metal. The outermost wall was coated in bronze, the middle wall was covered in tin, and the innermost wall, the one protecting the sacred central island, that was plated with orichalcum, a metal that, according to Plato, glowed with a red light and was considered second in value only to gold. We'll get to orichalcum in a moment because it deserves its own discussion, but just pause and imagine what this would have looked like. Approaching Atlantis from the sea, you'd see ring after ring of different coloured metal gleaming in the sunlight, bronze, then tin, then this mysterious reddish substance that nobody in the ancient world could quite identify. It would have been like sailing toward a giant jewelled crown rising from the ocean. The central island itself was no less impressive. Here stood the royal palace, growing larger with each generation as successive kings tried to outdo their predecessors. Plato describes it as covered in silver on the outside with gold pinnacles. Inside was a temple to Poseidon that measured about 600 feet long and 300 feet wide, roughly the size of a modern football stadium. The exterior was covered in silver, the roof was gold, and inside was an ivory ceiling, gold and silver and orichalcum decorations everywhere, and a statue of Poseidon so large that his head nearly touched that ivory ceiling. He was depicted standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, surrounded by 100 nereids riding dolphins. Subtle, it was not. But when your entire civilization is supposedly descended from the god of the sea, you're probably not going for understated minimalism. The Atlanteans also had hot and cold springs on the central island, which Plato notes was a gift from Poseidon. They used these springs to create elaborate bathing complexes, separate facilities for the kings, for commoners, for women, and even for horses and other animals. That's right, the Atlanteans had dedicated horse spas. Their livestock had better wellness facilities than most humans throughout history. While medieval Europeans were centuries away from regular bathing, and in many cases actively suspicious of it, the Atlanteans were apparently soaking their cavalry in temperature-controlled therapeutic waters. History, as always, is wildly unfair in how it distributes amenities. Beyond the ringed city itself, Atlantis possessed a vast rectangular plain, roughly 330 miles long and 230 miles wide, which was completely engineered for agriculture. The Atlanteans dug an enormous canal around the entire plain, a single channel 60 miles on each side, supposedly 100 feet wide and 30 feet deep. From this main canal, they cut smaller channels across the entire plain in a grid pattern, using them for irrigation, transportation of crops, and timber brought down from the mountains. The whole system was essentially an ancient agricultural megaproject, turning the natural landscape into a perfectly organized food production machine. Plato claims this plain could support the enormous Atlantean army, which tells you something about its supposed productivity, or tells you something about Plato's tendency toward exaggeration, possibly both. So how could any of this actually work? Let's think about it from an engineering perspective. The concentric ring design, while visually impressive, would present massive challenges. First, you'd need to excavate millions of cubic feet of rock and earth to create those water channels. Then you'd need to ensure the water level stayed consistent. Too high, and your land rings flood. Too low, and your ships can't pass. The underground tunnels would need constant maintenance to prevent collapse. The metal-plated walls would require more bronze, tin, and orichalcum than any ancient civilization could reasonably produce. And all of this would need to be built on an island that, according to Plato, was also seismically active enough to eventually sink in a single day. Honestly, it sounds less like urban planning and more like a disaster waiting to happen with extra steps. Modern engineers who've analysed Plato's descriptions have generally concluded that while individual elements might be technically possible, the combined system would be extraordinarily difficult to build and maintain. The nearest real-world comparison might be something like the Netherlands' water management systems or Venice's canal network, but even those don't come close to the scale Plato described. Either the Atlanteans had technology far beyond anything else in the ancient world, or Plato was engaging in some creative embellishment. Given that he was a philosopher trying to make a point about ideal societies and their downfall, not an architect submitting building permits, the latter seems more likely. But then again, that's what makes the mystery so tantalizing. The details are just specific enough to make you wonder. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, or rather, the mystery metal on the wall, orichalcum. The word comes from the Greek orichalkos, meaning mountain copper or mountain bronze, and Plato's description of it has been driving researchers absolutely mad for centuries. He says it was mined in many parts of Atlantis, that it sparkled with a reddish glow, that it was considered second in value only to gold, and that the innermost walls and the floor of the Temple of Poseidon were covered with it. That's it. That's all we know. No chemical composition, no description of how it was made, no helpful instructions for future metallurgists. Plato essentially said, and they had this amazing metal called orichalcum, and then moved on like he hadn't just dropped the biggest material science mystery in history. So what was it? Theories abound, and none of them are fully satisfying. The most common scholarly assumption is that orichalcum was simply a type of brass, an alloy of copper and zinc. Brass does have a golden, sometimes reddish colour, and it would have been valuable in the ancient world. The Greek word orichalcum was later used by Roman writers to describe brass, which supports this interpretation. But here's the problem. If orichalcum was just brass, why did Plato describe it as something so special? The Greeks and their neighbours had been making brass for centuries by Plato's time. It was nice, sure, but it wasn't cover your temple floors with it valuable. Calling brass the second most precious metal after gold would be like calling aluminum the most precious metal today. Technically useful, but hardly rare or special. Other researchers have proposed that orichalcum might have been a copper-gold alloy, sometimes called rose gold in modern terminology. This would explain the reddish sparkle and the high value. It would also explain why we don't find much of it in the archaeological record. A copper-gold alloy would eventually be separated and reused for its gold content. The problem is that Plato implies orichalcum was mined, not manufactured, which doesn't fit with an alloy. Unless the Atlanteans had some natural source of copper-gold ore that we've never discovered, this theory hits a wall. Then again, if Atlantis sank beneath the waves, any unique mineral deposits would have gone with it. Convenient for the mystery, frustrating for the scientists. Some more adventurous theorists have suggested that orichalcum might have been an entirely different metal or alloy that's been lost to history. Perhaps something with unusual properties that we can't replicate because we don't know the exact composition or manufacturing process. This is the lost technology hypothesis, and it's popular among Atlantis enthusiasts who believe the civilization was more advanced than mainstream archaeology accepts. The counter-argument, of course, is that metals don't just disappear from human knowledge. We've figured out pretty much every useful metal and alloy that can exist based on the periodic table. If orichalcum was real and valuable, someone somewhere would have kept making it. The fact that it only appears in Plato's account and nowhere else in ancient literature suggests it might have been a literary invention rather than a physical substance. Interestingly, there have been some archaeological finds that believers have connected to orichalcum. In 2015, divers off the coast of Sicily discovered a shipwreck containing 39 ingots of an unusual metal alloy. Analysis revealed it was about 80% copper and 20% zinc, essentially a high-quality brass. News outlets immediately ran with headlines about orichalcum discovered, which was a bit of a stretch since we have no way to verify what the ancient Atlanteans did or didn't use. The ingots were probably just valuable trade goods from the ancient Mediterranean, nothing more mystical than that. But the discovery does show that unusual metal alloys were being produced and traded in antiquity, which at least proves that orichalcum-like materials existed in some form. The real significance of orichalcum, though, isn't what it was made of, it's what it represents. It's the perfect symbol for Atlantis itself, a substance that's described in just enough detail to seem real, but with too little information to ever be conclusively identified. It sparkles tantalizingly at the edge of possibility, always suggesting that maybe, just maybe, there's more to this story than philosophical allegory. Every century brings new theories, new candidates, new reasons to keep searching. And every century orichalcum remains just out of reach, glowing with its reddish light in our imaginations, covering temple walls in a city that may never have existed. What makes both the architecture and the mystery metal so compelling is their internal consistency. Plato didn't just throw random details together, he created a coherent picture of a civilization that was fantastically wealthy, technologically sophisticated, and built around the sea. The concentric rings make sense for a maritime power. The underground ship tunnels make sense for a people who valued naval commerce. The metal-plated walls make sense for a nation that had access to abundant mineral resources. And orichalcum, whatever it was, makes sense as the crown jewel of those resources. Either Plato was an incredibly meticulous world builder, or he was describing something that, on some level, actually existed. The question of which one it was has been keeping us busy for 2,500 years, and honestly we're probably no closer to answering it than Solon was when he first heard the story in that Egyptian temple. But architecture and metallurgy only tell part of the story. What about the people who supposedly built all of this? Atlantis wasn't just a city, it was an empire, ruled by 10 kings descended from Poseidon himself. And how they governed, how they kept the peace among themselves, and how they eventually lost their way is where Plato's story transforms from impressive engineering into a cautionary tale that echoes across the ages. So you've got this magnificent island with its concentric rings, its underground ship tunnels, its walls gleaming with bronze and tin and mysterious glowing metal. Now comes the obvious question: who runs this place? Because a civilization this complex doesn't just organize itself. Someone has to make decisions, settle disputes, and presumably deal with the ancient equivalent of zoning regulations. And Plato's answer to this question is both elegant and slightly unhinged. Atlantis was ruled by 10 kings, all of them direct descendants of Poseidon, all of them governing their own territories, and all of them bound by sacred laws inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum in the most important temple on the island. It's like a constitutional monarchy, a federal system, and a religious cult all rolled into one spectacular package. Let's start at the beginning, because this is where Greek mythology and political philosophy collide in the most Plato way possible. Remember Cleito, the mortal woman Poseidon fell for? The one he impressed by terraforming an entire mountain into concentric rings. Well, she gave him 5 sets of twin boys. 10 sons in total, which is either divine blessing or a logistical nightmare depending on your perspective. Poseidon, being a thoughtful deity when it came to real estate distribution, divided Atlantis among all 10 of his sons. The eldest, Atlas. Yes, the same name as the titan who holds up the sky, though a different character entirely, got the central island and the surrounding region, plus the honour of having the whole place named after him. Atlantic Ocean, Atlantis, Atlas. It all connects. The other 9 brothers received their own portions of the island and the surrounding territories, creating an instant royal family with built-in succession planning. Each of these 10 kings had absolute authority within his own domain. He could make laws, administer justice, and rule his people however he saw fit. In theory, this could have been a recipe for disaster. 10 independent rulers, each with their own army and their own interests sharing one island. That's basically the setup for every civil war in history. But Poseidon, apparently having thought this through, established a set of sacred laws that all 10 kings had to follow. These laws were inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum, naturally, because why use ordinary stone when you have magical glowing metal? And this pillar stood in the very centre of the Temple of Poseidon, in the heart of the central island. The laws covered the relationships between the kings, their obligations to each other, and crucially what they could and couldn't do in times of conflict. The most important rule: the kings were forbidden from taking up arms against one another. No matter what disputes arose, no matter what grievances accumulated over the generations, fratricidal war was absolutely off the table. If one king felt wronged by another, there were proper channels. The descendants of Atlas, as the senior line, had certain judicial privileges, but even they couldn't condemn a fellow king to death without the agreement of at least half of the other kings. It was essentially an ancient version of checks and balances, designed to prevent any single ruler from accumulating too much power, while also ensuring that the confederation didn't tear itself apart through internal warfare. Plato, who spent much of his philosophical career thinking about ideal forms of government, clearly put a lot of thought into how a perfect state might regulate its own leadership. But the most fascinating part of the Atlantean political system wasn't the laws themselves, it was how they were renewed and enforced. Every 5 or 6 years, the 10 kings would gather at the Temple of Poseidon for a ceremony that was part religious ritual, part constitutional convention, and part really elaborate team-building exercise. First, they would hunt sacred bulls that roamed freely in the temple grounds. These weren't your ordinary cattle. They were animals dedicated to Poseidon himself, and capturing one was apparently no easy task. The kings hunted using only clubs and nooses, no weapons allowed, which gives you an idea of both the religious significance and the physical demands involved. Imagine 10 kings, each probably accompanied by significant royal egos, chasing bulls around a temple courtyard with nothing but sticks and rope. Dignified? Probably not. Entertaining? Almost certainly. Once they captured a bull, the real ceremony began. The kings would lead the animal to the orichalcum pillar where the sacred laws were inscribed, and there they would sacrifice it. The blood of the bull would be mixed into a bowl of wine, and each king would drink from this mixture while swearing an oath to uphold the laws of Poseidon. They would vow to judge according to the inscribed laws, to never command or obey any command that violated those laws, and to punish anyone who attempted to break them. After the oaths, they would dedicate the offering to Poseidon, have a feast, and then, once darkness fell, put on dark blue robes and sit in judgment on any accusations that had accumulated since their last meeting. Whatever verdicts they reached would be inscribed on golden tablets, and dedicated in the temple as permanent records. It was democracy, autocracy, and theocracy, all operating simultaneously, lubricated by bull's blood and very old wine. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, you're not wrong. But it's also not entirely fictional in its inspiration. Plato was drawing on real traditions from the ancient Mediterranean. Bull worship was widespread in the ancient world. The Minoans of Crete famously had bull-leaping rituals, and bulls were sacred animals in many Near Eastern cultures. Blood oaths were common in ancient treaty-making. Mixing blood with wine and drinking it together was a powerful symbol of shared fate and mutual obligation. And the idea of kings gathering periodically to renew their allegiances and settle disputes has parallels in many early civilizations. Plato wasn't inventing from scratch. He was taking familiar elements and combining them into something grander, more systematic and more philosophically meaningful. The political structure of Atlantis also reflects Plato's broader thinking about the best forms of government. Throughout his works, Plato was obsessed with the question of how states should be organized. His most famous work, The Republic, imagines a city ruled by philosopher kings who have been trained from childhood to pursue wisdom and justice above all else. Atlantis represents a different approach, a government based not on philosophical education, but on divine law and familial bonds. The 10 kings weren't philosophers, they were warriors and administrators who derived their authority from their descent from a god. The system worked not because the rulers were exceptionally wise, but because they were constrained by sacred laws they couldn't change. It's a more pessimistic view of human nature in a way. Plato seems to be saying that even semi-divine rulers need external constraints to prevent them from abusing their power. And this is where the story gets interesting, because Atlantis doesn't stay perfect. The whole point of Plato's tale is that this magnificent civilization, with its incredible architecture and its elegant political system and its divine heritage, eventually falls apart. The 10 kings start out as models of virtue and wisdom. They value justice over wealth, community over individual gain, and spiritual goods over material possessions. For generation after generation, they rule according to Poseidon's laws, and Atlantis prospers. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, things begin to change. The divine element in their bloodline becomes diluted as they intermarry with mortals. The proportion of God to human in each successive generation shifts, and with it, their values and priorities shift too. Plato describes this decline in almost genetic terms, which is fascinating given that he was writing 2,000 years before anyone understood heredity. He says that as long as the divine nature remained strong in the kings, they looked down on wealth as a burden rather than a blessing. They weren't impressed by gold and luxury because their souls were focused on higher things. But as the mortal element grew stronger, they began to lose this perspective. They started to admire wealth. They began to desire power for its own sake. They looked at their magnificent city not with gratitude, but with greed, always wanting more. The very qualities that had made Atlantis great, its resources, its military might, its strategic position, became temptations rather than blessings. This is Plato at his most moralistic, and it's also where the story connects most directly to his contemporary concerns. Athens in Plato's time was itself an empire, having built a confederation of allied city-states that it increasingly dominated through military and economic pressure. The Athenians had started out as champions of Greek freedom against Persian aggression, but over time they had become imperialists themselves, extracting tribute from their allies and crushing any city that tried to leave their alliance. Plato watched his own city transform from a democracy defending liberty into an empire pursuing conquest, and the parallel to Atlantis is unmistakable. Even the best-designed political system, even one established by the gods themselves, can decay when human nature is given free rein. The 10 kings, in the end, become indistinguishable from the tyrants Plato despised. They pursue war not for defense but for conquest. They accumulate wealth not for the benefit of their people, but for personal glory. They become, in Plato's words, unseemly in their behaviour, a loaded term that suggests both moral and aesthetic failure. They have lost the divine spark that made them worthy of rule, and now they're just 10 men with armies and ambitions, which is pretty much the worst-case scenario for any political system. The confederation that Poseidon established to prevent conflict becomes instead a war machine, united not by sacred law, but by shared hunger for expansion. It's worth noting that Plato never actually finishes this part of the story. The Critias dialogue breaks off abruptly, mid-sentence, just as Zeus is about to gather the gods to decide what to do about the fallen Atlanteans. We never get to read Plato's account of the divine judgment or the catastrophe that follows. Some scholars think the dialogue was simply left incomplete. Plato died or lost interest or moved on to other projects. Others suggest that the incompleteness is deliberate, that Plato wanted his readers to supply the ending themselves. After all, If you've been paying attention, you know what happens to civilizations that become corrupt and aggressive. The Greeks had plenty of examples to draw from, including their own recent history. What we do know, from the earlier Timaeus dialogue where the story is first introduced, is that Atlantis ultimately attacks the Mediterranean world and is defeated by ancient Athens. The Atlanteans, with their million-soldier army and their 1,200 ships, should have been unstoppable. But tiny Athens, a city of virtuous warriors who haven't been corrupted by wealth and power, manages to stand alone against them and win. It's David versus Goliath, except David is an entire city-state, and Goliath is an island empire with divine ancestry and glowing metal walls. Plato uses this contrast to make his point as clearly as possible. Virtue beats resources, character beats technology, and good governance beats sheer power. It's an optimistic message wrapped in a tragic story, which is very on brand for Greek philosophy. And then, of course, comes the famous ending. After the war, in a single terrible day and night, Atlantis sinks beneath the waves. Earthquakes and floods swallow the entire island, leaving nothing but impassable shoals in the ocean. The civilization that defied nature with its engineering, that defied politics with its confederation, that defied mortality with its divine bloodline, gone, completely and utterly, in less than 24 hours. The 10 kings, the sacred laws, the orichalcum pillar, the temple of Poseidon, the bull sacrifices, all of it vanishes beneath the sea. It's the ultimate punishment for hubris, the final lesson in what happens when humans forget their place in the cosmic order. But before we get to that catastrophe, there's one more piece of the Atlantean puzzle we need to examine. Because Atlantis wasn't just a wealthy island with a clever political system, it was a military superpower, and the army that Plato describes makes every other ancient fighting force look like a neighborhood watch program. We're talking numbers that boggle the mind, organization that anticipates modern military structures, and a capacity for conquest that threatened to reshape the entire ancient world. The machine of war that the 10 Kings commanded is where our story goes from impressive to genuinely terrifying. Let's talk numbers for a moment, because Plato's description of the Atlantean military is where this story goes from impressive ancient civilization to wait, that can't possibly be right. According to the Critias dialogue, the island of Atlantis could field an army of over 1 million soldiers. 1 million. To put that in perspective, the entire population of Athens during its golden age was maybe 300,000 people, including women, children, and enslaved individuals. The actual fighting force Athens could muster was somewhere around 30,000 hoplites on a good day. Alexander the Great conquered most of the known world, with an army that peaked at around 50,000 troops. And here's Plato casually describing an island nation with a standing military force that wouldn't be matched by any single nation until the Industrial Age. Either Atlantis had discovered something about population growth that the rest of the ancient world missed, or Plato was making a very deliberate point about the scale of the threat his ideal Athens would have to face. Let's break down the military structure as Plato describes it, because the details are almost more impressive than the headline numbers. The basic organizational unit was the lot, a square of land roughly 10 stades on each side, which works out to about 1¼ square miles. The Great Plain of Atlantis was divided into 60,000 of these lots, and each lot was responsible for providing a specific contribution to the national defense. Every lot had to supply one leader for its contingent, 2 heavy-armed soldiers, 2 slingers, 3 stone shooters, 3 javelin men, 4 sailors to help crew the navy, and 2 horses with riders plus a chariot with a driver and a warrior to ride. In it. If you add all that up and multiply by 60,000 lots, you get some truly staggering numbers. The chariot force alone was 10,000 vehicles strong. 10,000 chariots, each requiring 2 horses, a driver, and a warrior, plus support staff to maintain the vehicles and care for the animals. The logistics of feeding and managing 20,000 war horses would have been a monumental undertaking, even for a modern military. In the ancient world, it would have required an agricultural infrastructure dedicated almost entirely to horse fodder. The cavalry, separate from the chariot corps, numbered 240,000 mounted warriors. These weren't just guys who knew how to ride. They were trained military horsemen, presumably equipped with weapons and armor. Where did Atlantis get 240,000 suitable war horses? How did they train 240,000 men to fight from horseback? These are questions Plato conveniently doesn't address, which is either an oversight or a deliberate choice to emphasize the mythical scale of Atlantean power. The infantry was equally absurd in its proportions. Light-armed troops, slingers, archers, javelin throwers, numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Heavy infantry, the ancient equivalent of main battle tanks, numbered 120,000 men equipped with the best armor and weapons the Atlantean economy could produce. And then there was the navy, 1,200 warships fully crewed and ready for action. A Greek trireme typically needed about 200 men to operate, 170 rowers, plus officers, sailors, and marines. If the Atlantean ships were similar in size, we're talking about 240,000 naval personnel just to keep the fleet operational. Add in shipyard workers, harbour staff, and the people who built and maintained the vessels, and you've got a maritime industry that would dwarf anything else in the ancient Mediterranean. Now here's where a skeptical mind starts asking uncomfortable questions. An island, even a large island, producing an army of this size. The population required to support such a military would have to be in the tens of millions at minimum. For comparison, the entire population of the Roman Empire at its height was maybe 60 million people, spread across 3 continents and controlling the most productive agricultural lands in the Western world. Atlantis, according to Plato, was smaller than Libya and Asia Minor combined, a substantial landmass, but nowhere near the size needed to support Roman-scale population numbers. And yet the Atlantean military alone, not counting civilians, women, children, and the people who actually grew the food and made the weapons, supposedly exceeded the armies of imperial Rome. The math simply doesn't work unless Atlantis had either supernatural agricultural productivity or Plato was engaging in deliberate exaggeration, which of course he almost certainly was. Plato wasn't writing a military history, he was constructing a philosophical argument. The point of making Atlantis impossibly powerful wasn't to provide an accurate census of an ancient civilization. It was to emphasize the magnitude of what Athens had supposedly accomplished. If Atlantis had a medium-sized army, comparable to other ancient powers, then defeating them would be impressive but not remarkable. But if Atlantis had a military force that dwarfed anything the world had ever seen, then tiny Athens standing alone against them becomes an act of almost superhuman virtue. The numbers are propaganda, essentially, designed to make the good guys look better by making the bad guys look unstoppable. But let's play along for a moment and imagine what such a military force could actually do. The 1,200 warships alone would have been enough to dominate the entire Mediterranean. The largest naval battle in ancient history, the Battle of Salamis, involved maybe 1,000 ships total on both sides. The Atlantean fleet could have fought that battle twice over with ships to spare. Control of the sea meant control of trade, control of communication, and the ability to project power anywhere along the coast. An Atlantean admiral could have blockaded any port, raided any coastal city, and transported troops to any beach without serious opposition. The Mediterranean world, which depended on sea trade for everything from grain to luxury goods, would have been completely at Atlantis's mercy. The chariot force adds another dimension of power projection. In the ancient world, chariots were both a weapon of war and a symbol of elite status. Having 10,000 of them meant having 10,000 military units that could move faster than infantry, strike harder than cavalry, and intimidate the hell out of any opponent who had never seen such a force assembled. The psychological impact alone would have been devastating. Imagine you're a soldier in some small Greek city-state, armed with a bronze spear and a wooden shield, and you see the horizon fill with 10,000 war chariots bearing down on your position. Your training covers fighting other hoplites in formation. It definitely does not cover fighting a mechanized armored division from the Bronze Age. The army's organization also suggests a sophisticated command structure. Plato doesn't give us details about Atlantean military tactics, but the division into lots with standardized contributions implies a bureaucratic system capable of tracking resources, maintaining rosters, and coordinating logistics across a vast territory. This wasn't a tribal warband that assembled when the chief called. It was an organized military machine with standardized units, clear chains of command, and the infrastructure to mobilize and supply 1 million soldiers. Modern militaries have general staffs and computer databases to manage this kind of complexity. The Atlanteans would have needed an army of scribes and administrators just to keep track of who was supposed to show up where with what equipment. The ancient world did produce some impressive bureaucracies. Egypt and Mesopotamia come to mind, but nothing on the scale that Atlantean military logistics would have required. And what would this army have been used for? according to Plato, conquest. The Atlanteans, having grown corrupt and greedy, turned their military might outward. They didn't just want to defend their island paradise, they wanted to rule the world. Their empire had already expanded to include territories in Africa up to the borders of Egypt and in Europe as far as Italy. The whole Mediterranean was in their sights. This is where Plato's story connects to the broader theme of imperial overreach that runs through Greek literature. The Persians had tried to conquer Greece and failed. The Athenians had built their own empire and eventually destroyed themselves through arrogance and overextension. Now here was Atlantis, the ultimate imperial power, attempting the same thing on an even grander scale. The pattern was familiar to Plato's readers, and the lesson was clear. Empires that pursue unlimited expansion eventually meet their limits, usually violently. The tactics the Atlanteans would have employed are left to our imagination, but we can make some educated guesses based on their resources. Naval dominance would have allowed them to bypass coastal defences and land troops wherever they wanted. Chariot charges could break up enemy formations before the infantry engaged. The sheer mass of their army meant they could absorb casualties that would cripple a smaller force and keep fighting. They could besiege multiple cities simultaneously, maintain supply lines across vast distances, and reinforce any position that came under pressure. Against the fragmented city-states of the ancient Mediterranean, each with its tiny army and limited resources, the Atlanteans would have been unstoppable. They could have done what Rome eventually did, conquer the entire Mediterranean world, except they could have done it faster and more thoroughly, with military resources Rome could only dream of, but they didn't. And that's the whole point of Plato's story. Despite all their power, despite their 1,000,000 soldiers and 1,200 ships and 10,000 chariots, the Atlanteans were stopped. Not by a coalition of nations, not by a rival superpower, but by a single city-state that valued virtue over military might. Ancient Athens, with its modest army and its citizen soldiers, somehow defeated the greatest military force the world had ever seen. Plato is deliberately stacking the odds against his heroes to make their victory more meaningful. It's the underdog story to end all underdog stories, and the message is unmistakable. Moral strength beats material strength every single time. Of course, we should note that this ancient Athens Plato describes bears only a passing resemblance to the historical Athens of his own time. The Athenians who supposedly defeated Atlantis were an idealized version of the city. Farmers who fought because duty demanded it, not professional soldiers. Citizens who lived simply and virtuously, not the sophisticates of Periclean Athens with their philosophers and playwrights and complicated politics. Plato is essentially inventing a Golden Age Athens to serve as the moral counterweight to Golden Age Atlantis, and neither one maps cleanly onto historical reality. But that's okay, because Plato isn't writing history. He's writing philosophy with a story attached, and the story is designed to illustrate what happens when a civilization chooses material power over spiritual virtue. The Atlantean military, for all its impressive numbers, represents the ultimate dead end of material development. They had everything: the soldiers, the ships, the chariots, the resources to conquer the world, and it wasn't enough. Their society had become so focused on accumulating power that they forgot what power was supposed to be for. The 10 kings who once sacrificed bulls to Poseidon and renewed their sacred oaths now commanded armies for personal glory. The warriors who once defended their island home now marched across foreign lands in pursuit of empire. The navy that once protected Atlantean trade routes now blockaded enemy ports and burned coastal cities. All that military might, and it only hastened their destruction by making them believe they were invincible. And in the end, of course, the military couldn't save them. When Zeus and the gods decided to punish Atlantis for its corruption, no number of soldiers could stop what was coming. You can't fight earthquakes with chariots. You can't blockade a tsunami with warships. The greatest military force in ancient history was swept away in a single day, along with everything else the Atlanteans had built. It's a reminder that there are forces in the universe that human power cannot overcome, a lesson that was as relevant to Plato's Athens, still nursing wounds from its catastrophic defeat in the Peloponnesian War, as it is to any modern nation that mistakes military strength for true security. But before we get to that final catastrophe, we need to understand what set it in motion. The military was just the symptom. The disease was something deeper. The blood of the gods, which once made the Atlanteans wise and virtuous, had grown thin over generations of mortal marriages. and as that divine spark faded, so too did everything that had made Atlantis worth preserving. The story of that decline, of how the greatest civilization in history became the most corrupt, is where Plato's moral philosophy truly comes into focus. Here's the thing about being descended from a god. It sounds amazing on paper, but it comes with some serious complications. Imagine your great-great-great-grandfather was literally Poseidon, ruler of the seas, shaker of the earth, one of the most powerful beings in the Greek pantheon. Pretty impressive lineage, right? Now imagine that with each generation that divine spark gets a little dimmer. Your grandfather was 1/8 god, your father was 1/16, you're 1/32 divine, which is basically a rounding error. At what point do you stop being a demigod and start being just a regular person with a really interesting family tree and some inflated expectations? This, according to Plato, was the fundamental problem that doomed Atlantis. Not earthquakes, not floods, not military defeat. The slow, inexorable dilution of divine blood until there was nothing left but human nature in all its greedy, ambitious, self-destructive glory. Plato's account of the Atlantean decline is surprisingly psychological for a text written over 2,000 years ago. He doesn't just say, they became bad, he explains the mechanism by which goodness eroded. In the beginning, when the divine element in their nature was still strong, the Atlanteans possessed what Plato calls a true and entirely lofty spirit. They valued wisdom over wealth, friendship over dominion, virtue over conquest. When they looked at their magnificent city with its golden temples and orichalcum walls, they didn't see possessions to be hoarded. They saw tools for living well. Their attitude toward luxury was essentially nice to have, but not what life's about. They understood that material abundance was a means to an end, not the end itself. If you've ever met someone who's genuinely wealthy but completely unpretentious about it, you know the type. The early Atlanteans were apparently an entire civilization of those people. This sounds almost too good to be true, and that's precisely the point. Plato is describing a kind of moral golden age, a state of being that humans rarely achieve and never maintain. The early Atlanteans were good not because they worked at it, not because they had excellent teachers or strict laws, but because their very nature inclined them toward goodness. The divine blood running through their veins made virtue feel natural in a way it doesn't for ordinary mortals. They didn't struggle against greed because greed simply didn't appeal to them. They didn't have to resist the temptation of tyranny because power for its own sake seemed pointless. It's like describing a person who has no sweet tooth. Technically possible, but most of us can't really imagine what that feels like. But here's where Plato's moral psychology gets interesting. He says that this divine element, this natural inclination toward virtue, was diluted many times by many admixtures of mortal kind. In other words, the Atlantean kings kept marrying regular humans. Not other demigods, not carefully selected partners who might preserve the divine lineage, just ordinary people. And with each generation, the ratio of god to human shifted a little further toward the human side. This is essentially a genetic theory of morality, which is a bit uncomfortable from a modern perspective but made perfect sense in the Greek philosophical tradition. Your nature determined your potential. Your choices determined whether you lived up to that potential or fell short of it. The Atlanteans started with exceptional potential and gradually lost it through what we might call careless breeding practices. Now, Plato is careful to note that this dilution didn't produce immediate catastrophe. The decline was gradual, almost imperceptible. Each generation was slightly worse than the one before, but not so much worse that anyone noticed. It's like the parable of the boiling frog. If you drop a frog in hot water, it jumps out immediately, but if you put it in cool water and heat it slowly, supposedly it won't notice until it's too late. Whether or not that's actually true for frogs, it's definitely true for civilizations. Moral decay rarely announces itself with trumpets and warning signs. It creeps in through small compromises, minor ethical lapses, gradually shifting norms that make yesterday's unacceptable into today's regrettable but understandable. The Atlanteans didn't wake up one morning and decide to become corrupt. They drifted into corruption one barely noticeable step at a time. What did this look like in practice? Plato gives us some specifics. The Atlanteans began to appear, to those who had eyes to see, base and unseemly. They were losing their finest possessions, not their gold or their ships or their orichalcum, but their wisdom and their virtue. Yet ironically, to most observers, they seemed more blessed than ever. The treasures kept piling up. The empire kept expanding, the military kept winning. By every material measure, Atlantis was thriving. Only someone who understood what true prosperity looked like could recognize that they were actually declining. It's a bit like watching someone destroy their health while their bank account grows, technically successful, but heading toward disaster. The critical shift in Plato's account was in how the Atlanteans viewed their wealth. The early kings had looked at gold and silver as nice, but not particularly important. The later kings began to admire these things, to value them for their own sake, to measure their success by how much they had accumulated. This sounds like a small change. Who doesn't like having nice things? But for Plato, it represented a fundamental corruption of priorities. Once you start valuing wealth as an end in itself, you've lost the thread. You've confused the means with the goal, and once that confusion takes hold, there's no natural stopping point. More is always better. Enough is never enough. The entire society becomes oriented around acquisition rather than virtue, competition rather than cooperation, appearance rather than substance. What makes this analysis so enduring is how recognizable it remains. Plato was writing about a mythical civilization that supposedly existed 9,000 years before his time, but he could just as easily be describing any number of historical and contemporary societies. The pattern he identifies, prosperity leading to complacency, complacency leading to corruption, corruption leading to collapse, has repeated itself countless times throughout history. Rome, in many historians' telling, followed a similar arc. Austere, virtuous republic becomes wealthy empire becomes decadent, self-destructive mess. The same narrative has been applied to Spain, to Britain, to various dynasties in China and the Islamic world. Whether or not these analyses are entirely accurate, they draw on a deep intuition that wealth and power are dangerous gifts, easily misused, often corrosive to the very qualities that made them possible in the first place. Plato also introduces an interesting theological dimension to the decline. He says that Zeus, king of the gods, eventually noticed what was happening to Atlantis. The god of justice watched the descendants of his brother Poseidon become unseemly, and decided that punishment was necessary, not to destroy them, but to teach them a lesson. Zeus wanted to humble the Atlanteans, to remind them of what they had lost, to give them a chance to recover their virtue through suffering. This is divine intervention as moral education, which is a distinctly Greek way of understanding how the gods interact with humanity. The gods don't just arbitrarily punish or reward, they maintain cosmic order, and when that order is disrupted by human wickedness, they act to restore the balance. The mechanism of this divine judgment was to be a gathering of all the gods at Zeus's dwelling, which being placed in the centre of the universe perceives all things that partake of generation. There, Zeus would pronounce his verdict on Atlantis. And here, maddeningly, Plato's account breaks off. The Critias dialogue ends mid-sentence, just as Zeus is about to speak. We never hear what the king of the gods actually said. We never get Plato's description of the catastrophe from the divine perspective. Some scholars think this is an accident. Plato died or abandoned the project before finishing. Others think it's deliberate. The ending is obvious, so why bother writing it? Either way, the effect is haunting. We're left at the moment of judgment, knowing what's coming but never witnessing it directly. What we do know from the earlier Timaeus dialogue is that Atlantis was ultimately destroyed by earthquakes and floods in a single day and night. The mechanism was natural, or appeared natural, but the cause was divine displeasure. The gods didn't just randomly decide to sink an island, they responded to moral failure with cosmic consequences. This connection between ethics and natural disaster is uncomfortable for modern readers, who generally don't believe that earthquakes are punishment for bad behaviour. But for the ancient Greeks, it made perfect sense. The universe was fundamentally moral in their view. It couldn't simply ignore human wickedness. When people violated the cosmic order severely enough, the cosmos pushed back. Natural disasters weren't random accidents, but meaningful events, parts of an ongoing divine conversation with humanity. The moral lesson Plato draws from all this is both simple and profound. External success means nothing without internal virtue. The Atlanteans had everything: wealth, power, technology, military might, divine ancestry. And it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough because those things don't actually make you good. And if you're not good, nothing else matters in the end. This is vintage Plato, of course. His entire philosophical project was aimed at understanding what makes a life truly worth living, and his consistent answer was that virtue, not wealth or power or pleasure, was the key. Atlantis was his case study in what happens when a civilization gets this wrong, when it mistakes material success for genuine flourishing. There's also a political dimension to this moral tale. Plato was writing for Athenians who had recently lived through the catastrophic Peloponnesian War, who had watched their own empire crumble through a combination of military defeat, political dysfunction, and moral bankruptcy. The parallels between Atlantis and Athens would have been obvious to his readers. Athens too had been virtuous once, or so the story went. Athens too had accumulated wealth and power. Athens too had begun to use that power for aggression rather than defense, and Athens too had suffered devastating consequences. Plato wasn't just philosophizing in the abstract, he was providing his fellow citizens with a framework for understanding their own recent history and avoiding similar mistakes in the future. The tragedy of the Atlantean decline is that it was entirely preventable. Nothing forced the kings to marry mortals rather than seeking partners who might preserve the divine bloodline. Nothing forced them to admire gold more than wisdom. Nothing forced them to pursue empire rather than contentment. At every step they could have chosen differently, but each choice made the next wrong choice slightly more likely, until eventually the momentum of decline became irresistible. This is how Plato understands moral failure, not as a single dramatic decision, but as an accumulation of small ones, each seemingly insignificant, collectively catastrophic. By the time the Atlanteans realized they were in trouble, they had already become the kind of people who couldn't get themselves out of trouble. Their moral resources had been squandered generations before the final crisis arrived. And yet, even in their corruption, the Atlanteans weren't monsters. Plato never portrays them as cartoonishly evil. They were recognizably human, pursuing goods that most people pursue, making mistakes that most people make. Their tragedy was that they had started with so much more potential than ordinary humans, which made their fall that much steeper. They should have been the pinnacle of civilization, the proof that it was possible to combine wealth with wisdom, power with virtue. Instead, they became yet another example of human nature's tendency towards self-destruction when left without proper guidance. The blood of Poseidon, which should have lifted them above mortal weaknesses, ultimately couldn't protect them from themselves. This brings us to the confrontation that Plato sets up but never fully describes, the war between corrupt Atlantis and virtuous Athens. Because before the gods delivered their judgment, before the earthquakes and floods swallowed the island, there was a military conflict. The greatest imperial power the world had ever seen marched against a small city-state that had nothing but virtue on its side, and somehow, impossibly, virtue won. That story, of how tiny Athens held the line against overwhelming force, is where Plato's moral philosophy becomes a narrative of hope rather than despair. Picture the scene. It's roughly 9,600 years before Plato's time, and the mightiest military force ever assembled is sweeping across the Mediterranean. The Atlanteans have already conquered chunks of North Africa up to the borders of Egypt. They've taken portions of Europe as far as Italy. Their fleet of 1,200 warships dominates the seas. Their army of over 1 million soldiers has never known defeat. Every nation in their path has either submitted or been crushed. And now they're looking east, toward the scattered city-states of Greece, toward the fertile lands of the Nile Valley, toward total domination of the known world. Nothing can stop them. Except, apparently, one tiny city-state on a rocky peninsula with maybe 20,000 soldiers and a really stubborn attitude about freedom. This is the war between Athens and Atlantis, and if you've never heard of it, that's because it exists solely in Plato's imagination. Or, if you prefer the more romantic interpretation, in records so ancient that only Egyptian priests remembered them. Either way, it's one heck of a story. Let's be clear about what Plato's setting up here. He's not describing a fair fight. This isn't two evenly matched opponents squaring off to see who's better. This is the ancient equivalent of a professional boxing champion facing a determined kindergartner. Atlantis had resources that no ancient power could match. Athens, this ancient primordial Athens that Plato describes, not the classical city he actually lived in, was a small agrarian community of farmer warriors who valued virtue over virtually everything else. They didn't have gold-plated temples or orichalcum walls. They didn't have underground ship tunnels or 10,000 chariots. What they had was courage, discipline, moral clarity, and apparently the kind of tactical genius that emerges when your back is against the wall and surrender isn't an option. David versus Goliath had better odds than this matchup, and David at least had a sling and the element of surprise. The Athens that Plato describes in the Timaeus and Critias dialogues is explicitly not the Athens of his own era. He goes out of his way to emphasize this point. This primordial Athens existed 9,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt, which means it predates the classical Greek civilization by an almost incomprehensible stretch of time. It's a mythical Athens, an idealized Athens, an Athens that embodies everything Plato thought a city-state should be. The citizens were divided into distinct classes: warriors, farmers, artisans, each performing their proper function without envy or conflict. The warriors lived communally, owning no private property, dedicating themselves entirely to the defense of the city. They were, in essence, the guardians that Plato would describe in his Republic, implemented in a real society thousands of years before he was born to theorize about them. This ancient Athens had some interesting characteristics that set it apart from both its Atlantean enemy and from the historical Athens Plato knew. For one thing, women could be warriors. Plato specifically mentions that in this primordial society, women trained and fought alongside men, a radical idea even by his relatively progressive standards, and absolutely shocking to most ancient Greek readers who considered women's participation in warfare absurd at best. The city was governed by a warrior elite who had no interest in accumulating wealth, who lived simply despite having access to resources, and who made decisions based on what was good for the community rather than what benefited themselves. Personally, if this sounds like a political fantasy, that's because it is. Plato was painting a picture of the perfect city, using the Atlantis story as a frame to show what virtue could accomplish when facing overwhelming material power. The war itself is frustratingly vague in Plato's account. He tells us that Atlantis launched an invasion aimed at conquering both Greece and Egypt in one massive campaign. He tells us that the other Greek city-states either fell to the invaders or proved unreliable allies, leaving Athens to face the Atlantean threat alone. And he tells us that Athens not only repelled the invasion, but actually liberated the territories Atlantis had already conquered, freeing everyone within the Pillars of Hercules from Atlantean domination. But the details, the battles, the strategies, the heroes, the decisive moments are almost entirely missing. Plato was a philosopher, not a military historian, and he was clearly more interested in the moral of the story than in the play-by-play. We know Athens won. We know their victory was spectacular. We don't know how they pulled it off, which leaves plenty of room for imagination and speculation. How could Athens possibly have won? Let's think about this strategically, assuming for a moment that any of it actually happened. The Atlanteans had overwhelming numerical superiority, but they were also fighting far from home, at the end of extremely long supply lines in unfamiliar terrain. Naval power, their greatest strength, would have been less decisive in the narrow waters around Greece than in the open Atlantic or the broad Mediterranean. The Greek landscape, mountainous, fragmented, full of natural defensive positions, would have neutralized some of the advantages of chariot warfare and massed infantry. And the Greeks, even in Plato's idealized version, would have known the terrain intimately, would have been fighting for their homes and families, and would have possessed that desperate courage that comes from having no retreat option available. There's also the question of morale and cohesion. The Atlantean army was enormous, but enormous armies have enormous problems. Coordinating 1 million soldiers in the ancient world, without radio communication or rapid transportation, would have been a logistical nightmare. Different units might have spoken different languages, followed different commanders, had different levels of training and motivation. The Atlanteans were also, by this point in their history, fighting for conquest rather than survival, for glory and gold rather than home and hearth. That kind of motivation can sustain an army when things are going well, but it tends to evaporate quickly when the going gets tough. The Athenians, fighting for everything they loved, would have had far more to lose and therefore far more reason to hold the line no matter the cost. But ultimately, the strategic details don't matter to Plato's point. He's not writing a military manual, he's writing a moral fable. The Athenian victory represents the triumph of virtue over vice, of quality over quantity, of spiritual strength over material power. The message is clear. A small group of truly good people, properly organized and committed to justice, can defeat a vast empire of morally compromised individuals no matter how many resources that empire commands. It's an encouraging thought, especially if you happen to live in a small city-state surrounded by larger powers, which was the situation of pretty much every Greek polis in the ancient world. Plato was giving his readers hope, wrapped in the trappings of prehistorical epic. The political message would have resonated powerfully with Plato's contemporary audience. Athens in his lifetime had been through some serious trauma. The Peloponnesian War, which ended just a few decades before Plato wrote the Atlantis dialogues, had devastated the city. Athens had started that war as the leader of a powerful maritime empire, confident in its wealth and military strength. It had ended the war defeated, humiliated, stripped of its empire, and ruled briefly by a brutal oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants. Plato himself had lived through this catastrophe, had watched friends and family members killed in the political violence that followed, had seen his beloved city brought low by a combination of external enemies and internal corruption. The parallels to Atlantis would not have been lost on him or his readers. In a sense, Plato was offering Athens a choice between two models. You could be like Atlantis, wealthy, powerful, militarily dominant, but morally corrupt and ultimately doomed. Or you could be like the ancient Athens of the story, modest in resources but rich in virtue, and therefore capable of triumphs that no amount of gold or soldiers could achieve. The subtext was clear. Athens had tried the Atlantean path, building an empire through naval power and extracted tribute, and it had ended in disaster. Maybe it was time to try something different. Maybe the way forward was to recover the virtues that supposedly characterized the city in its earliest, purest form. Maybe being good was more important than being powerful. This isn't just ancient Greek moralizing, it's a critique that echoes through history. Every imperial power eventually faces the question of whether its material success is worth the moral compromises required to maintain it. The Romans would wrestle with this question as their republic transformed into an autocracy. The British would wrestle with it as their empire expanded and contracted. Americans wrestle with it today. Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, identified a pattern that has repeated itself countless times. Nations that prioritize power over principle eventually discover that power without principle is self-destructive. Atlantis is the cautionary tale, ancient Athens is the aspiration. The timing of the war in Plato's narrative is also significant. The conflict happens at the peak of Atlantean corruption, just before the gods decide to intervene. In other words, Athens defeats Atlantis precisely when Atlantis is at its worst, when the divine blood has been most diluted, when the kings have become most corrupt, when the society has strayed furthest from its original virtue. This suggests that moral decay doesn't just anger the gods, it also weakens you in practical worldly terms. The Atlanteans lost not despite their corruption, but because of it. Their moral failures translated into military failures. They had become the kind of people who couldn't win against truly virtuous opponents, no matter how many soldiers they fielded. There's an interesting parallel here to how the ancient Greeks thought about the Persian Wars, the defining conflict of their historical memory. In those wars, which happened about a century and a half before Plato wrote, a handful of Greek city-states had faced the Persian Empire, the largest and most powerful political entity the world had yet seen. Against all odds, the Greeks had won, first at Marathon, then at Salamis and Plataea. The Greeks explained this unlikely victory in moral terms. They were free men fighting for liberty, while the Persians were slaves of a despot fighting because they were forced to. Freedom beat slavery, quality beat quantity, virtue beat vice. Plato's Atlantis story is essentially a mythological version of this narrative, pushed back into the impossibly distant past and stripped of its specific historical details to become a timeless parable about the power of righteousness. The choice of Athens as the hero is also politically loaded. Plato was an Athenian, of course, so there's an element of local pride, but Athens in his time was also a democracy, a political system Plato famously distrusted. He blamed democracy for the death of his teacher Socrates, and his ideal state in the Republic is anything but democratic. So why make democratic Athens the saviour of the ancient world? The answer, I think, is that Plato's primordial Athens wasn't democratic at all. It was ruled by a warrior elite who made decisions for the common good, essentially an aristocracy of virtue. By placing this idealized political system in the deep past and crediting it with the greatest military victory imaginable, Plato was making an argument for the kind of governance he preferred. The real Athens, with its messy democracy and its imperial ambitions, was a fallen version of something better. The way forward was to recover that lost greatness, which meant abandoning democratic excess and returning to rule by the wise and virtuous. The war also serves as a setup for the catastrophe that follows. After Athens defeats Atlantis, both civilizations are destroyed. Atlantis by earthquakes and floods, ancient Athens by some unspecified disaster that apparently wiped out the warrior class and erased their achievements from memory. This double ending is crucial to Plato's story structure. If only Atlantis had been destroyed, the moral would be simple. Bad guys get punished, good guys prosper, justice wins. But by destroying virtuous Athens too, Plato adds a layer of tragedy and mystery. Even the best human achievements are vulnerable to cosmic forces beyond our control. Even virtue can't guarantee survival. The gods may favour the righteous, but they don't protect them from everything. It's a more nuanced and, frankly, more honest view of how the universe works than a simple morality play would provide. The fact that this war was forgotten is also part of Plato's narrative design. According to his account, the knowledge of these events survived only in Egyptian temple archives, inaccessible to the Greeks themselves. The Athenians of Plato's day had no memory of their ancestors' greatest triumph. They didn't know that their city had once saved the world from tyranny. This creates a poignant sense of lost glory, of potential that was achieved and then lost and then forgotten entirely. It's like discovering that your great-great-grandfather was secretly a war hero, but nobody remembered to tell you. There's something powerful about recovered memory, about learning that you come from a tradition of excellence even if that tradition has been interrupted. Plato was giving his fellow Athenians a new origin story, or rather, a very old origin story that could inspire them to become worthy of their ancestors. Modern readers might wonder why, if the Egyptians had records of this war, no trace of them has ever been found. No Egyptian texts mention Atlantis. No Greek sources before Plato refer to this primordial conflict. The story appears, fully formed, in Plato's dialogues and nowhere else. Skeptics take this as evidence that Plato invented the whole thing, that the Egyptian priests, the chain of transmission through Solon, the war itself, all of it was a literary device to give his philosophical arguments the weight of historical truth. Believers counter that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, that Egyptian archives were largely destroyed over the millennia, that the story could be a garbled memory of real events even if the details have been distorted. The debate continues, as it has for 24 centuries, and probably will for 24 more. What's undeniable is the power of the narrative. A small, virtuous city standing alone against overwhelming tyranny and winning. It's an archetype that resonates across cultures and centuries. We see echoes of it in the story of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held the pass against the Persian horde. We see it in the myth of the Alamo, in the Siege of Malta, in countless war movies where a plucky band of heroes defeats a numerically superior enemy through courage and cunning. There's something deeply human about this story pattern, something that speaks to our desire to believe that right makes might, that the good guys can win even when the odds are impossible. Plato tapped into that universal longing and gave it a specific form that has outlasted his own civilization by millennia. And with Athens victorious and Atlantis defeated, we arrive at the most famous part of the story, the ending. Because the war wasn't the end for either civilization. What followed was something far more dramatic, far more permanent, and far more mysterious. In a single day and night of terror, the earth itself turned against the mighty island empire. Earthquakes shattered its magnificent architecture. Floods swallowed its concentric rings. The greatest civilization the world had ever known vanished beneath the waves, leaving nothing but legend and a few lines in a philosopher's dialogue. The last day of Atlantis is where our story reaches its climax, and where the mystery deepens into something that has haunted human imagination ever since. In a single day and night of misfortune. That's how Plato describes the end of Atlantis. Not a gradual decline over centuries, not a slow fade into obscurity like so many civilizations before and since. One day, one night, and then nothing but mud and memory. It's the most dramatic ending in the history of literature, and possibly the most dramatic ending in actual history, if, of course, any of it actually happened. The greatest civilization the ancient world had ever known, with its orichalcum walls and its million-soldier army and its 10 kings, descended from Poseidon himself, wiped from the face of the earth in less than 24 hours. If you're looking for proof that the universe has a flair for the theatrical, this is Exhibit A. Plato's description of the catastrophe is frustratingly brief, given how much detail he lavished on the architecture and political system. He tells us that violent earthquakes and floods struck Atlantis. He tells us that the warrior class of ancient Athens was swallowed by the earth at the same time. Apparently the gods weren't playing favourites. And he tells us that the island of Atlantis disappeared beneath the sea, leaving behind only impassable shoals of mud that made navigation in that part of the ocean impossible. That's it. No description of buildings collapsing, no accounts of panicked citizens fleeing for their lives, no heroic last stands or tragic final moments. Just earthquakes, floods, gone. For a philosopher who could spend pages describing the exact measurements of the Temple of Poseidon, this brevity is almost suspicious. Either Plato didn't have more information, or he deliberately chose to leave the details to our imagination. The timing of the destruction is significant. It happens immediately after the war with Athens, which means it happens at the moment of Atlantis' greatest moral failure. The gods, specifically Zeus, who had gathered the other deities to pronounce judgment, had decided that the Atlanteans needed to be taught a lesson. The earthquakes and floods weren't random natural disasters, they were divine punishment for hubris and corruption. This interpretation would have made perfect sense to Plato's original readers, who believed that the gods actively intervened in human affairs and that natural catastrophes often carried moral meaning. When Poseidon shook the earth, it wasn't just tectonics, it was communication. The gods were speaking, and what they were saying was, "You've gone too far." But what could actually cause an entire island civilization to disappear in a single day? Let's put on our geologist hats for a moment and consider the possibilities, because this is where Plato's myth intersects with real-world science in fascinating ways. The ancient Mediterranean was, and still is, one of the most geologically active regions on the planet. Earthquakes are common. Volcanic eruptions have shaped the landscape repeatedly throughout history. Tsunamis have devastated coastal communities multiple times. If Atlantis was real and located somewhere in this region, there are several natural mechanisms that could have destroyed it quickly and completely. The most popular candidate among those who take the Atlantis story seriously is volcanic eruption, specifically the catastrophic explosion of the island of Thera, modern Santorini, around 1600 BCE. This was one of the largest volcanic events in human history, with an estimated explosive force equivalent to several hundred atomic bombs. The eruption didn't just blow the top off the volcano, it caused the entire centre of the island to collapse into the empty magma chamber below, creating the distinctive caldera that tourists photograph today. The resulting tsunamis would have been enormous. Some estimates suggest waves over 100 feet high radiating outward in all directions. Any coastal civilization in the eastern Mediterranean would have been devastated. The Thera eruption is particularly intriguing because it coincides roughly with the decline of the Minoan civilization on nearby Crete. The Minoans were the most advanced culture in the Aegean at the time. They had elaborate palaces, sophisticated art, a writing system, and extensive maritime trade networks. After the Thera eruption, Minoan civilization went into rapid decline, eventually being absorbed by the Mycenaean Greeks. Some researchers have suggested that the Minoans were the real inspiration for Atlantis, an island culture of remarkable sophistication, destroyed by a sudden geological catastrophe, remembered only in garbled legends passed down through the centuries. Plato, according to this theory, heard a distorted version of Minoan history from Egyptian sources and transformed it into his philosophical allegory. The problem with the Minoan hypothesis is that the details don't quite match. Crete wasn't beyond the Pillars of Hercules, it's in the eastern Mediterranean, not the Atlantic. The Minoans weren't destroyed in a single day. Their decline took generations after the Thera eruption. And while Minoan culture was impressive, it wasn't the world-conquering superpower that Plato describes. The theory requires assuming that Plato, or his sources, got almost everything wrong about the location, timeline, and scale of events, while somehow preserving the core memory of a sophisticated island civilization destroyed by natural disaster. It's possible, but it requires a lot of special pleading. Another geological mechanism that could explain sudden destruction is submarine landslides triggering massive tsunamis. The continental shelf off the coast of northwest Africa, near the Canary Islands and the Moroccan coast, is known to be unstable. If a large section of underwater sediment suddenly slipped, it could generate waves that would cross the Atlantic in hours. The 1929 Grand Banks earthquake off Newfoundland caused an underwater landslide that produced a tsunami travelling at over 100 miles per hour, and that was a relatively small event by geological standards. A larger submarine collapse in the ancient Atlantic could theoretically have swamped an island civilization with little warning. You'd have a few hours at most between the first tremors and the arrival of the killing wave. Then there's the possibility of sea level rise, which brings us to the end of the last ice age. Between roughly 20,000 and 8,000 BCE, global sea levels rose by over 400 feet as the continental ice sheets melted. This wasn't a gradual, imperceptible process. It happened in pulses, with periods of rapid flooding interspersed with relative stability. Geologists have identified several meltwater pulse events during this period when sea levels rose by several meters in just a few centuries. Coastal settlements would have been repeatedly inundated, forcing populations to migrate inland or to higher ground. If Atlantis was a low-lying coastal or island civilization existing during this period, rising seas could have gradually submerged it over generations, though this doesn't quite fit Plato's single day and night timeline. However, there's a more dramatic possibility connected to Ice Age flooding. Some researchers have proposed that the release of enormous glacial lakes during deglaciation could have caused sudden, catastrophic flooding events. Lake Agassiz, for example, was a massive body of meltwater that covered much of central Canada during the Ice Age. When the ice dams containing it failed, the lake would have drained catastrophically into the ocean, potentially raising sea levels by several feet in a matter of days or weeks. If you happened to be living on a low island in the Atlantic when one of these megafloods occurred, your entire world could indeed have disappeared very quickly. Not quite a single day, perhaps, but close enough for mythological purposes. The earthquake component of Plato's account also deserves attention. We tend to think of earthquakes as brief events, a few seconds or minutes of shaking, then it's over. But major seismic events can trigger cascading failures that last much longer. Liquefaction, where saturated soil temporarily loses its strength and behaves like liquid, could cause buildings and even entire landmasses to sink. Secondary earthquakes and aftershocks can continue for days or weeks. If Atlantis was built on geologically unstable ground, which a volcanic island certainly would be, a major earthquake could have initiated a chain of events that destabilized the entire structure of the civilization. The underground tunnels connecting the concentric rings, the carefully engineered canals, the massive temples, all of it would have been vulnerable to seismic disruption. There's also the possibility of combination events, where multiple disasters strike in rapid succession. Imagine an earthquake triggering a volcanic eruption, which triggers a tsunami, which floods coastal areas already weakened by seismic damage. Such cascade events do occur. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami in Japan demonstrated how one disaster can trigger another in rapid succession. For an ancient observer witnessing such a compound catastrophe, it would indeed seem like the gods had turned their full fury against the earth. The separate mechanisms would blend together into one overwhelming apocalypse, leaving survivors, if there were any, with confused memories of earthquakes and floods and fire all happening simultaneously. Plato's mention of impassable shoals is an interesting detail that some have tried to verify. He says that after Atlantis sank, the location became unnavigable due to mud and shallow water. This would be consistent with a large landmass suddenly subsiding beneath the ocean surface. The debris and sediment would create exactly the kind of hazardous conditions Plato describes. Some researchers have pointed to the relatively shallow waters around the Azores or the shoals off the coast of Morocco as potential locations matching this description. Others have noted that the Strait of Gibraltar was much shallower in ancient times, with sandbanks and mudflats that could have made passage difficult. Whether any of this actually relates to Atlantis is impossible to say, but it does show that Plato's geographical details have some basis in Mediterranean navigational reality. The destruction of Athens in the same catastrophe is harder to explain geologically. Athens is not on an island, not near a volcano, and not particularly vulnerable to flooding from the sea. Plato says the Athenian warriors were swallowed by the earth, which sounds like an earthquake or perhaps a sinkhole event. But it's odd that such a localized disaster would happen at exactly the same moment as Atlantis' destruction, thousands of miles away. The most likely explanation is that Plato needed both civilizations to be destroyed for his story to work. If virtuous Athens had survived while corrupt Atlantis was punished, someone might have objected that surely there would be records of this civilization's continued existence. By destroying both, Plato conveniently explains why no evidence of either ancient civilization remains. It's a narrative solution to a plot problem, which suggests that Plato was thinking like a storyteller as much as a historian. The theological implications of the catastrophe would have been clear to Plato's readers. This was divine judgment in its most dramatic form, not a plague that kills individuals, not a famine that weakens a society over time, but an instantaneous annihilation that left nothing behind. The gods had given the Atlanteans every advantage: divine ancestry, incredible natural resources, a perfect political system, the most powerful military ever assembled, and the Atlanteans had squandered all of it through moral corruption. Zeus's response was proportional to the offence. If you're going to fail this spectacularly, your punishment will be equally spectacular. The message to Plato's Athenian readers was unmistakable. The gods are watching, and there are limits to how much human wickedness they will tolerate. But there's also something deeply melancholic about the ending. All those architectural marvels, the concentric rings, the orichalcum walls, the underground ship tunnels, the hot springs and cold springs, the Temple of Poseidon with its golden roof and ivory ceiling, all of it gone forever. All the accumulated knowledge of a civilization that supposedly existed for thousands of years vanished without a trace. The 10 kings with their sacred laws and bull sacrifices, the million-soldier army with its 10,000 chariots, the fleet of 1,200 warships, nothing survived except a story told by Egyptian priests to a Greek visitor, eventually written down by a philosopher who may or may not have believed it himself. Even if Atlantis was entirely fictional, there's something poignant about imagining its end. It's the ultimate expression of the human fear that everything we build, everything we accomplish, everything we love might someday simply disappear, as if it had never existed at all. The single day and night time frame has become one of the most iconic elements of the Atlantis legend, repeated endlessly in books, movies, and documentaries. It captures something essential about how we imagine catastrophes: sudden, overwhelming, final. Real disasters are usually messier than this. They unfold over hours or days, with periods of apparent calm between crisis points. But in our imagination, apocalypse is instantaneous. One moment the world is normal, the next moment everything is destroyed. Plato's description taps into this archetypal fear, which is probably why it has resonated so powerfully across the centuries. We all know, on some level, that stability is an illusion, that the foundations of our lives could crumble without warning. Atlantis gives that fear a name and a story. Modern disaster movies owe a considerable debt to Plato's account, whether their creators realize it or not. The sudden destruction of a great civilization by natural forces, the hubris that preceded the fall, the handful of survivors who escaped to tell the tale, these elements recur constantly in disaster fiction from the 1970s to today. Roland Emmerich has essentially built a career on filming different versions of the Atlantis story. Cities destroyed by tidal waves in The Day After Tomorrow, ancient prophecies of apocalypse in 2012, the literal Atlantis legend in 10,000 BC. The formula works because Plato figured out the essential ingredients 2.5 millennia ago: a great civilization, a moral failure, a spectacular punishment. We're still telling the same story because it still speaks to our deepest anxieties about progress, power, and the fragility of everything we've built. What happened in the aftermath of the catastrophe? Plato doesn't tell us much, but we can infer some things from his narrative. The knowledge of Atlantis was supposedly preserved only in Egyptian records, which suggests that information was scarce even in antiquity. The site became unnavigable, which would have prevented any investigation or salvage. Over time, the story faded from common knowledge, surviving only among the specialized priesthood who maintained the temple archives. When Solon visited Egypt roughly 9,000 years after the events, the priests treated the story as ancient history, interesting, perhaps useful for philosophical lessons, but not something anyone expected to verify. It was already legend by then, and legend is precisely what it has remained. The destruction of Atlantis marks the end of the narrative proper, but it's hardly the end of the story's influence. For 2,500 years, people have been trying to figure out what Plato was really describing. Was it a historical memory, a philosophical allegory, a sophisticated work of fiction, or some combination of all three? The search for Atlantis has sent explorers to the bottom of the ocean and the heights of speculation. It has inspired scientific theories and crackpot hypotheses in roughly equal measure, and it shows no signs of stopping anytime soon. The mystery of where Atlantis went is, in some ways, more compelling than the story of what Atlantis was. And that search, the centuries of expeditions, theories, discoveries, and disappointments, is where our story goes next. Because humanity has never been content to simply accept that Atlantis is lost forever. We keep looking, keep hoping, keep believing that somewhere under the waves or beneath the sand, the ruins of the greatest civilization in history are waiting to be found. The hunters for the sunken continent are a story in themselves, one that tells us as much about human nature as Plato's original tale ever did. The moment Plato put down his stylus and declared Atlantis lost beneath the waves, humanity collectively said, "Challenge accepted." Because if there's one thing people love more than a good mystery, it's trying to solve that mystery, preferably with dramatic expeditions, controversial theories, and the occasional career-ending academic controversy. For 2,500 years, explorers, scholars, cranks, and dreamers have been hunting for the lost continent, and they've looked in places so diverse and improbable that you have to admire their creativity even when questioning their methodology. From the depths of the Atlantic to the highlands of Bolivia, from the sands of the Sahara to the ice of Antarctica, Atlantis hunters have left no stone unturned, no seafloor unscanned, and no theory too wild to publish. The most obvious place to look, naturally, was the Atlantic Ocean itself. The name seemed like a dead giveaway. Atlantic, Atlantis. Surely there's a connection. Medieval cartographers were already placing mysterious islands in the Western Ocean, lands with evocative names like Antilia and the Isle of Seven Cities, which some historians have argued were confused memories of Atlantis filtering through. Centuries of oral tradition. When Europeans finally crossed the Atlantic and discovered the Americas, some scholars immediately suggested that these new continents were the remnants of Atlantis, or at least colonies established by Atlantean survivors. The indigenous peoples of the Americas, in this view, were descendants of the lost civilization, which explained their impressive pyramids and sophisticated calendars. This theory conveniently ignored the fact that Native American cultures had their own perfectly good origin stories that didn't require any assistance from sunken Greek islands. But scientific rigor was not exactly the strong suit of 16th century speculation. The Atlantic theory got its biggest boost in 1882, when a former US congressman named Ignatius Donnelly published a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Donnelly was not a trained historian or archaeologist, but he was an enthusiastic researcher and a gifted writer, and his book became a massive bestseller that shaped Atlantis speculation for generations. His central argument was that Atlantis had been a real place in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, a large island that served as the source of all subsequent human civilizations. The Egyptians, the Mayans, the Greeks, the Vikings, according to Donnelly, they all traced their origins back to Atlantean colonists who spread across the globe before the motherland sank. He pointed to similarities between pyramids in Egypt and Mexico, between flood myths in different cultures, between linguistic patterns that he believed showed common origin. Modern scholars have thoroughly debunked most of Donnelly's specific claims, but his basic framework, Atlantis as the fountainhead of world civilization, continues to influence popular belief. The Mediterranean became another popular hunting ground, and in many ways it makes more sense than the Atlantic. Plato was Greek, after all. He was writing for a Greek audience. The civilizations he mentions as being threatened by Atlantis, Egypt, Libya, the city-states of the Aegean, are all Mediterranean powers. Why would the story focus so heavily on this region if Atlantis was located thousands of miles away in the middle of the ocean? Some researchers have argued that the Atlantis story is actually a garbled memory of a real Mediterranean catastrophe, perhaps the volcanic destruction of the island of Thera around 1600 BCE. Thera, now known as Santorini, was home to a thriving Minoan civilization that was essentially wiped out when the island's volcano exploded in one of the largest eruptions in human history. The blast was so powerful it may have triggered tsunamis that devastated coastal communities throughout the eastern Mediterranean. An advanced island civilization suddenly destroyed by natural catastrophe. Sound familiar? The Thera hypothesis has attracted serious scholarly attention, though it faces significant problems. The timeline doesn't match. Plato said Atlantis existed 9,000 years before Solon, while Thera's destruction happened only about 1,000 years before. The geography doesn't match. Plato placed Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, meaning west of Gibraltar, while Thera is in the Aegean Sea, nowhere near the Atlantic. And the details don't match. Minoan Thera was a sophisticated culture, but it didn't have concentric ring architecture, orichalcum-plated walls, or an army of 1 million soldiers. Supporters of the theory suggest that Plato or his sources exaggerated or misremembered the details, that 9,000 years might be a scribal error for 900 years, that beyond the Pillars of Hercules might have had a different meaning in earlier times. Skeptics counter that if you have to change most of the details to make the theory work, maybe the theory doesn't actually work. The search has extended far beyond the obvious candidates. In the 1970s, underwater explorer Jacques Cousteau investigated the Mediterranean seafloor for traces of Atlantis, finding some interesting ruins but nothing definitively Atlantean. Other researchers have looked at the Richet structure in Mauritania, a striking geological formation in the Sahara that consists of concentric rings, natural rings created by erosion, but rings nonetheless. The Richet structure is on land, which would seem to disqualify it, but some theorists argue that sea levels and geological conditions were different enough in the distant past that the area might once have been coastal or submerged. It's a stretch, but when you're hunting Atlantis, stretching is kind of the point. Bolivia has produced its own Atlantis theories, centered on the ancient site of Tiahuanaco near Lake Titicaca. Some researchers have argued that the Andes were once at sea level, that Tiahuanaco was a coastal city that got lifted miles into the sky by tectonic activity, and that the sophisticated stonework there represents Atlantean engineering. These claims require ignoring pretty much everything geologists know about how tectonic plates actually move, but they've proven surprisingly resilient in popular imagination. Antarctica has also been nominated, most notably by writers like Graham Hancock, who suggest that the southern continent might have been ice-free and inhabited in the distant past, before some catastrophic pole shift buried it under glaciers. Mainstream scientists consider this hypothesis somewhere between unlikely and physically impossible, but it makes for compelling reading. Spain has attracted particular attention in recent decades, especially the coastline around Cadiz and the mouth of the Guadalquivir River. This area was home to Tartessos, a semi-legendary civilization that flourished in the first millennium BCE and then vanished from history, possibly destroyed by Carthage or absorbed by other cultures. Some researchers have argued that Tartessos was the real Atlantis, or at least the civilization that inspired Plato's story. The geography works better than most alternatives. Tartessos was genuinely beyond the Pillars of Hercules from a Greek perspective, and the culture was genuinely wealthy and sophisticated. Documentary makers have claimed to find underwater structures off the Spanish coast that might be Tartessian, though archaeologists remain skeptical about both the identifications and the Atlantis connection. The most spectacular modern search was probably the 2011 documentary that claimed to have found Atlantis in the marshlands of southern Spain's Doñana National Park. Using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, researchers identified what appeared to be circular structures buried beneath the mud, matching Plato's description of concentric rings. Media coverage was breathless and extensive. Unfortunately, subsequent investigation revealed that the structures were probably natural features, and the project's lead researcher was not exactly a mainstream academic. The Atlantis had once again failed to materialize, leaving behind only another chapter in the long history of premature announcements and dashed hopes. So after 2.5 millennia of searching, what does mainstream science have to say about Atlantis? The short answer is, it almost certainly didn't exist, at least not in any form that resembles Plato's description. The longer answer involves understanding why scientists are so confident, what the actual evidence shows, and what real civilizations might have contributed to the legend if it has any historical basis at all. Let's start with the geological argument, because it's the most fundamental. Plato said Atlantis was a large island, bigger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, located in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. For such an island to exist and then sink beneath the waves in a single day and night, certain geological conditions would have to be met. Specifically, there would need to be a mechanism capable of submerging an entire continent-sized landmass virtually instantaneously. Here's the problem. No such mechanism exists. Continents don't sink. The Earth's crust floats on the denser mantle beneath, and while tectonic processes can raise or lower land over millions of years, they can't make a continent disappear overnight. Earthquakes can cause localized subsidence, volcanic eruptions can destroy islands, tsunamis can temporarily flood coastal areas, but nothing in geology can explain an entire continent vanishing in 24 hours. Oceanographers have thoroughly mapped the Atlantic seafloor, and there's no trace of a sunken continent there. What they have found is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, an underwater mountain range where tectonic plates are spreading apart, creating new seafloor. This process pushes the Americas and Europe further apart each year. It doesn't sink land masses between them. The Atlantic basin is geologically young compared to some other ocean floors, and its history is well understood. There simply isn't room in that history for a continent to have existed and disappeared. Atlantis believers sometimes argue that science doesn't know everything, that there could be undiscovered processes or that the evidence was somehow erased. But science actually knows quite a lot about how the Earth works, and we haven't found evidence is very different from evidence could exist, but we just haven't found it. The archaeological argument is equally problematic. Plato described a civilization so advanced that it would have left traces everywhere. Trade goods, colonies, cultural influence, written records in other civilizations' archives. If Atlantis existed 9,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt, it would predate the earliest known civilizations by about 5,000 years. Yet there's no evidence of any such advanced culture anywhere in the archaeological record. The oldest permanent settlements we know of date to around 10,000 BCE. The first cities emerged around 4000 BCE. Writing was invented around 3200 BCE. An advanced civilization with metal walls, massive temples, and a written legal code existing 7,000 years before Sumer would be extraordinary. And extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So far, the evidence is not just insufficient, it's non-existent. Historians and classicists have their own reasons for skepticism, rooted in how they read Plato's text. The Atlantis story appears in two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, both written late in Plato's career. Significantly, no earlier Greek source mentions Atlantis, not Homer, not Herodotus, not any of the other writers who compiled myths and legends. If the story really came from Egyptian temple records passed down through Solon, it's strange that Solon himself never mentioned it in his surviving poetry, that none of his contemporaries recorded it, that it appears nowhere in Greek literature, until Plato decided to write it down. The chain of transmission Plato describes, Egyptian priests to Solon to Critias to Plato, is elegant but untraceable, and suspiciously convenient for someone making up a story and wanting to give it the appearance of ancient authority. Moreover, Plato was not above using fictional narratives to make philosophical points. He invented elaborate myths in other dialogues, the allegory of the cave, the chariot of the soul, the story of His contemporaries and immediate successors, including his own student Aristotle, apparently regarded the Atlantis story as a literary invention rather than historical fact. Aristotle reportedly said that Plato made up Atlantis and then conveniently destroyed it, so no one could check his work, a pretty damning assessment from someone who knew Plato personally and was intimately familiar with his philosophical methods. Later, ancient writers were divided on the question, but the trend over time was towards skepticism. By the medieval period, Atlantis had largely been forgotten in Europe, surviving mainly in occasional references by scholars who knew their Plato. That said, most historians don't think Plato invented the story entirely from nothing. It's more likely that he drew on various sources, real events, earlier myths, geographical knowledge of his time, and wove them together into a narrative that served his philosophical purposes. The Minoan civilization of Crete, which reached sophisticated heights around 2000 BCE before declining mysteriously, may have contributed details. The destruction of Helike, a Greek city that was swallowed by the sea in 373 BCE, just a few years before Plato wrote the Atlantis dialogues, may have provided inspiration for the catastrophic ending. Tartessos, the wealthy trading civilization of southwestern Spain, may have contributed the image of a powerful maritime state beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The Egyptian priests' claim to possess knowledge older than the Greeks may have been a real cultural belief that Plato incorporated, even if the specific story about Atlantis was fictional. The search for a real Atlantis continues to attract attention, but mainstream science has largely moved on. The consensus among archaeologists, historians and geologists is clear. Atlantis as Plato described it did not exist. There was no continent in the Atlantic, no advanced prehistoric civilization with orichalcum walls, no war with ancient Athens 9,000 years ago. What there was, almost certainly, was a brilliant philosopher who created a powerful parable about hubris, corruption, and divine justice, using the form of historical narrative to give his moral points greater impact. That the parable has outlived its creator by 2 millennia and spawned an entire industry of speculation is a testament to Plato's storytelling ability, if nothing else. And yet, after all the debunking, after all the failed expeditions and discredited theories, after all the geological impossibilities and archaeological absences, Atlantis refuses to disappear. Type Atlantis into any search engine and you'll find millions of results. Books, documentaries, websites, forums, discussion groups, ongoing expeditions. A new discovery of Atlantis makes headlines every few years, and each time people get genuinely excited before the inevitable disappointment sets in. Why? What is it about this story that makes it so impossible to kill? Part of the answer is simply good storytelling. Plato, whatever else he was, knew how to construct a narrative. Atlantis has everything a compelling story needs: an exotic setting, larger-than-life characters, moral complexity, spectacular action, and a dramatic ending. The mystery element, the fact that we don't know for certain whether any of it is true, adds an interactive dimension that straightforward history lacks. People can participate in the Atlantis story by developing theories, mounting expeditions, arguing with each other online. It's not just a tale to be passively consumed, it's a puzzle to be actively solved. That kind of engagement creates a relationship between story and audience that mere entertainment can't match. But there's something deeper going on as well, something that touches on fundamental aspects of human psychology. The Atlantis myth speaks to our longing for a lost golden age, a time when humanity was wiser, nobler, closer to the divine. This longing appears in cultures all over the world, from the Garden of Eden to the Hindu concept of the Satya Yuga, to countless indigenous traditions about ancestors who lived in harmony with nature before something went wrong. We seem to have a built-in sense that things were once better than they are now, that somewhere in the past there existed a state of grace from which we have fallen. Atlantis gives this vague longing a specific form and location. It tells us that the Golden Age was real, that it had an address, that its achievements were concrete and its loss was historical. Even if we can't return to it, we can at least know it existed. Related to this is the appeal of hidden knowledge. Atlantis believers often speak of secrets that mainstream science refuses to acknowledge, evidence that the establishment is suppressing or ignoring. This taps into a deep human suspicion of authority, a sense that the people in charge are keeping important truths from the rest of us. In an age of genuine institutional failures and documented cover-ups, this suspicion isn't entirely irrational. But Atlantis belief takes it further, suggesting that the very foundations of our understanding of history are wrong, that orthodox archaeology and geology are either incompetent or actively deceptive. For people who feel alienated from mainstream institutions, who feel that their knowledge and intuitions are not respected by the credentialed elite, Atlantis offers validation. It says, "You're right to be suspicious. There is more to the world than the experts admit. Your sense that something important is being hidden has a basis in reality." There's also the simple fact that mysteries are more interesting than solutions. Once you definitively prove that Atlantis didn't exist, the conversation is over. There's nothing more to discover, no further expeditions to mount, no more theories to develop. But as long as the question remains open, and for true believers, it's always open, the adventure continues. Every new underwater photograph, every anomalous archaeological finding, every satellite image that shows something vaguely circular becomes potential evidence, fuel for speculation, reason to keep searching. The hunt itself has become more important than the quarry. People who have spent years studying Atlantis, developing expertise in its supposed location and history, have invested too much to simply accept that it was all for nothing. Atlantis also functions as a mirror for each era's anxieties and hopes. In the 19th century, when Western powers were building global empires and scientific racism was at its height, Atlantis was often described as the homeland of a superior white race that had seeded civilization across the globe. In the mid-20th century, during the Cold War and the Space Age, Atlantis became associated with advanced technology, crystal power sources, flying machines, energy weapons. Today, as climate change raises sea levels and threatens coastal cities, Atlantis serves as a cautionary tale about environmental catastrophe and civilizational hubris. The story is flexible enough to absorb whatever meanings we project onto it, which is why it never feels dated or irrelevant. every generation finds something in Atlantis that speaks to its particular concerns. And perhaps most profoundly, Atlantis embodies the human hope that greatness is possible and recoverable. If an advanced civilization once existed, then advanced civilization is achievable. If that civilization fell through moral failure rather than inherent limitation, then we can avoid its mistakes. If its knowledge is merely lost rather than non-existent, then we might rediscover it. Atlantis is not just a story about the past, it's a story about potential, about what humanity might become if we learn the right lessons and make the right choices. That's a powerful idea, and it doesn't depend on Atlantis actually being real. The myth functions whether or not the history behind it is genuine, so where does that leave us? After 12 chapters exploring the origins, details, meanings, and implications of the Atlantis story, what conclusion can we draw? Perhaps this: Atlantis is real, just not in the way the believers think. It's real as a cultural phenomenon, as a psychological need given narrative form, as a philosophical thought experiment that escaped its original context and took on a life of its own. The island itself, with its concentric rings and orichalcum walls, probably never existed outside Plato's imagination. But the questions it raises, about power and corruption, about the relationship between material success and moral worth, about whether civilizations can learn from their predecessors' mistakes, are as relevant today as they were in ancient Athens. Plato would probably be amused, and maybe a little horrified, to learn what became of his little parable. He wrote it to make a point about virtue and governance, and instead it spawned 2 millennia of treasure hunting, conspiracy theories, and pseudo-scientific speculation. But maybe that's appropriate. Atlantis was always about the gap between human aspiration and human limitation, about how even the best intentions can go wrong, about how the pursuit of the wrong kinds of excellence leads to destruction. If the story itself has been corrupted and distorted over time, transformed from philosophical allegory into fodder for cable documentaries and internet forums, well, isn't that kind of the point? The search for Atlantis will continue. Somewhere right now, someone is poring over satellite imagery, convinced they've found something the experts missed. Someone is preparing a dive to an underwater site that might, just might, be the legendary island. Someone is writing a book that will finally prove everything the skeptics deny. And in another 2,000 years, assuming we're still around, people will probably still be looking. Because Atlantis isn't just a place. It's a dream, a hope, a question we can't stop asking. And as long as we keep asking, Atlantis, whatever it is, whatever it means, will never truly sink.